Is this some kind of joke? The voice, amplified by the high ceilings of the mess hall, cut through the din of silverware and conversation. Lieutenant Junior Grade David Miller, immaculately uniformed and freshly pressed, glared down the service line. He held a grease-stained plate that contained a perfectly acceptable cheeseburger, bun glistening under the fluorescent lights. Walter Hoffman, the 82-year-old man behind the counter, hired by the ship's welfare association for the temporary duty rotation, didn't look up immediately. He was focused, using a long metal spatula to scrape the griddle clean. His uniform consisted of a slightly too large blue apron, standard-issue non-slip shoes, and a faded navy blue shirt that looked like it had seen decades of laundry cycles. "I asked you a question, old man," Miller repeated, his tone laced with a specific brand of dismissive impatience reserved for those he perceived as wasting his time. A small crowd of younger sailors and petty officers had already begun to gather, drawn by the rising tension and the prospect of midday drama. Walter finally looked up. His eyes, though slightly faded around the edges, were clear and steady. They were eyes that had seen things, but right now, they held only simple courtesy. "No joke, sir. This isn't a retirement home kitchen, civilian. This is the USS Kearsarge. Attention to detail is paramount. If you can't get a simple cheese order right, what other corners are you cutting? Sanitation. Don't you realize we are underway? Mistakes here cost more than just 5 minutes of my lunch break." Miller's friends, 2 young ensigns, laughed obligingly from the nearby table. They had seen Walter around the ship for a few weeks, a quiet gray-haired figure who kept to himself, cooked perfectly adequate meals, and insisted on using antiquated slang like golly and darn. "Sir, I assure you my intention was to provide excellent service," Walter said, his voice quiet, almost husky. He pushed the plate back slightly, showing that he was ready to fix the error without argument. But Miller wasn't finished. He took a calculated step closer, towering over the old man. "You know, when I saw you shuffling around the engine room a few weeks ago, I thought you were part of the touring group that got lost. Now I find out you're messing up chow service. Are you volunteering, or is this some kind of mandatory work release program for guys who ran out of money?" The disrespect hung thick in the air. The tittering stopped. Even the ensign shifted uncomfortably. That was crossing a line. Walter was a civilian contractor, protected by certain rules, and more importantly, by common human decency. Walter's eyes narrowed slightly, a microscopic shift that only a very observant person would notice. His hands, which were surprisingly thick and gnarled, rested against the stainless steel countertop. "If you have a formal complaint regarding my conduct, Lieutenant, please direct it to the executive officer," Walter replied, his voice still low, masking a core of absolute stillness. "Oh, I will," Miller said, pulling out his phone, making a show of preparing to film the old man. "I'm going to make sure that the XO knows we have someone working the line who is clearly past his expiration date." As Miller spoke, he gestured widely, and his hand briefly knocked against the front of Walter's apron. Walter flinched, not in pain but in reaction. Miller laughed. "See? Shaky hands. Just get me a properly melted piece of cheddar, and stay out of my way." Miller turned to the line behind him, addressing the gathered sailors, clearly enjoying the audience. "This is what happens when standards drop, people. We need precision. We need sharp, focused minds, not this." Walter took a slow, deep breath. The only thing that moved on him besides his breathing was a small, faded patch sewn onto the shoulder strap of his blue shirt, just visible beneath the apron. The patch was a simple, circular design, crudely stitched, featuring a stylized thunderbird diving into a wave, colored in muted greens and browns that hadn't been in regulation since the 1960s. It meant nothing to the young sailors. It looked like something Walter picked up at a flea market. But to Walter, the slight scrape of Miller's hand across that patch was a jolt. He remembered standing in the oppressive humidity of a foreign port, the air thick with burning diesel and gunpowder. He remembered the feel of saltwater sting and the metallic tang of fear. He remembered sewing that patch himself, using scavenged thread by the light of a single bulb, right after the whole world tilted sideways. The patch wasn't just old, it was earned. It was a marker of a time when precision meant the difference between making it home and becoming just another name on a stone wall. Suddenly, a voice cut in, sharp and specific, from the edge of the crowd. It wasn't a loud voice, but it was pitched perfectly to carry the weight of immediate concern. "Lieutenant Miller, I think you've made your point," said Chief Petty Officer Eleanor Vance. Vance was a propulsion specialist, mid-30s, known for her no-nonsense attitude and loyalty to the enlisted crew. She didn't like bullies, especially those targeting the quiet, harmless old man who baked cookies for the evening shift. Miller immediately pivoted his contempt toward Vance. "Stay out of this, Chief. This is an administrative issue regarding food service standards. It looks like harassment to me, sir, Vance countered, stepping forward just enough to block Miller's immediate path to Walter. The man offered to fix your order. Take the fixed burger and move on. I will not tolerate insubordination, Miller hissed, and I certainly won't tolerate incompetence that results in poor morale. Get back to your duty station, Chief. Vance didn't move. Instead, her eyes, usually focused on engine dials, flickered away from Miller and toward a fixed chipboard phone mounted on the wall near the beverage station. She knew how these things worked. Miller wouldn't stop until Walter was humiliated or fired. Quietly, while Miller was preoccupied trying to assert his rank, Vance reached out, pulled the handset off the wall, and used the dial to input the 3-digit code for the command duty officer. Her hand shielded the mouthpiece, but her whisper was urgent. This is CPO Vance, engine room. I need an urgent call routed to the executive officer's office. Code red, non-life-threatening. Tell the XO there is a situation in the galley, and he needs to be advised about the civilian cook, Walter Hoffman. She paused, listening to the static-laced response on the other end. Yes, sir, Walter Hoffman. I need the XO to know that Lieutenant Miller is currently attempting to degrade and dismiss Mr. Hoffman based on a misplaced cheese order. I think the lieutenant is about to take disciplinary action he is not authorized to take. I'm worried about the repercussions of this situation if it escalates. Yes, please, sir. Send someone with authority immediately. Vance hung up, her face tight. Miller was still lecturing Walter about the importance of knowing one's place and respecting the chain of command, completely oblivious to the silent alarm that had just been raised. The energy in the mess hall shifted. The sailors who had been passively watching were now looking past Miller, past Walter, and toward the main hatches. They knew CPO Vance didn't make calls like that for fun. Something was coming. Justice, or at least high-ranking interference, was only minutes away. Miller, sensing the shift in the crowd's attention, mistook it for agreement. He felt emboldened, swelling with righteous authority. I've had enough of this. I'm contacting the logistics officer right now to have this contract revoked. You are a distraction, Hoffman. Get out of the galley. Go sit in the corner until the logistics O can arrange your transport back to shore. Walter didn't move. He stood behind the counter, the spatula still resting lightly in his grip. The calmness he exuded was not passive submission. It was the quiet readiness of a predator who has already assessed the threat and found it wanting. 2 decks above the mess hall, in the quiet, carpeted sanctuary of the executive officer's ready room, Commander Alicia Reyes was reviewing the ship's maintenance schedule. The secure line beeped twice, signaling an urgent, non-critical priority internal call. Reyes here. The voice on the other end was the command duty officer, strained and formal. Ma'am, CPO Vance has alerted us to an ongoing situation in the mess hall. Lieutenant Miller is currently engaged in a heated confrontation with the civilian food service contractor, Walter Hoffman. Reyes frowned. Walter? Is he okay? What's the problem? A complaint about the meatloaf. Ma'am, the complaint is over cheese, Swiss versus cheddar. But CPO Vance sounded genuinely alarmed about Miller's behavior. She believes he's attempting to fire or discipline the contractor on the spot. Reyes ran a hand through her closely cropped hair. Petty squabbles were common, but she didn't like the sound of this. Miller needs to stand down. He has zero authority over those contractors. Tell him to wait for Log O. And why code red for this? The CDO hesitated. Ma'am, CPO Vance specifically asked us to ensure you knew the name Walter Hoffman. She said she thinks it's about to get bad. The name hit Commander Reyes like a cold wave. The pen in her hand clattered onto the desk blotter. Walter Hoffman, she repeated, the sound barely a whisper. She straightened in her chair. All trace of fatigue vanished. Confirm that name. Hoffman. Confirmed, ma'am. Reyes snatched the secure phone again and barked into the receiver. Raise the captain. Right now. If he's not in the chair, I want him on the comms within 30 seconds. Alert my personal detail. Clear the hallways for immediate transit to the main mess deck. This is no longer a disciplinary issue, CDO. This is a critical security situation. The CDO sounded stunned. Security, ma'am. Over a food contractor? Listen to me closely, Reyes said, her voice dropping to an icy intensity. If that is the Walter Hoffman I think it is, and I pray to God it is not, we have made a monumental, unforgivable mistake. The moment Miller touches him, we have a strategic crisis on our hands. Get the captain. Down on the mess deck, Lieutenant Miller was reaching his peak of arrogance. The silence of the gathered sailors, the tightness in Chief Vance's stance. He interpreted it all as grudging respect for his decisiveness. Since you refuse to leave, I'm putting you on report for gross insubordination and failure to comply with a direct order from a commissioned officer, Miller declared, pulling a small notebook from his pocket. I'll have the XO ensure this report makes it to the contracting firm, and I'll personally recommend they never employ you again. You clearly cannot handle the pressure of shipboard service." He leaned in, his face inches from Walter's. "You may have fooled them on shore with your quiet, harmless grandfather routine, but this ship is a combat asset. We don't tolerate dead weight." He lifted his hand, pointing dramatically toward the nearest exit hatch, demanding Walter comply. Just as the moment stretched to its breaking point, a sound reverberated through the mess hall that silenced every single conversation, every click of silverware, every breath. It wasn't a warning alarm. It was the distinctive rhythmic, heavy-souled sound of senior officers moving at speed. The main hatch to the mess deck burst inward, causing the pressurized air to rush out. Leading the charge was Captain Harrison, the commanding officer of the Kearsarge, a man rarely seen outside the bridge or his ready room during midday ops. Flanking him was Commander Reyes, the XO, her expression one of barely contained fury. Trailing them were 3 security personnel and the ship's most senior Master Chief Petty Officer, all moving with a rigid purpose that signaled absolute command presence. The mess hall became utterly silent. Every sailor instantly stiffened, dropping whatever they held, eyes forward. The captain's gaze immediately swept the room, ignoring the general crowd and landing squarely on the point of tension. Lieutenant Miller, standing over the frail elderly civilian cook. Miller, completely oblivious to the gravity of the captain's arrival, snapped to attention with textbook precision. He saw the CO and XO and mistook their arrival as support for his crackdown on poor standards. "Captain, sir. Commander. Perfect timing, sir. I was just dealing with a clear case of civilian insubordination. I've placed the contractor on report and ordered him removed from the galley," Miller announced. His chest puffed out. Captain Harrison didn't acknowledge Miller's salute. He didn't even look at Miller. His eyes remained fixed on Walter Hoffman. The captain, a formidable man known for his disciplined reserve, slowly closed the distance to the counter. The silence that followed was so complete it was physically painful. Miller started to speak again. "Sir, this man couldn't even manage a basic—" Commander Reyes stepped forward, cutting Miller off with a sound that was half hiss, half growl. "Silence, Lieutenant. You are out of line." Captain Harrison reached the counter. He took one look at the worn, gray-haired man in the ill-fitting apron, and then slowly and deliberately, the commanding officer of the USS Kearsarge brought his right hand up to his brow in a perfect rigid salute. The Master Chief behind him instantly snapped to attention and executed a salute of equal deference. Commander Reyes followed suit, her face pale with embarrassment and reverence. The entire mess hall gasped, a single collective exhalation of shock. Sailors froze mid-bite. Miller's hand, which had been clutching his notebook, dropped uselessly to his side. Walter Hoffman, the elderly man who was supposed to be stacking trays, returned the salute. His motion was not crisp like the captain's. It was slow, a little stiff in the shoulder, but the angle of his arm and the precision of his hand position were flawless. Muscle memory honed by decades, not years. Captain Harrison held the salute until Walter dropped his hand. Then the captain spoke, his voice deep and carefully modulated, addressing Walter but loud enough for every soul in the mess hall to hear. "Harbor Master," the captain said, using a nickname that felt less like a greeting and more like a title of ancient nobility. "Sir, I regret to inform you that we have been delayed in welcoming you aboard properly." "This ship is your ship. Is everything to your satisfaction, sir?" Walter offered a small, tired smile. "The bacon is a little soft, Skipper, but otherwise the ship sails true. Thank you." The captain turned, his expression instantly transforming from respectful courtesy to cold, directed fury aimed squarely at Lieutenant Miller, who looked like a statue carved from ice. "Lieutenant Miller, do you know who this man is?" the captain demanded. Miller swallowed hard. "Sir, the civilian contractor Walter Hoffman. Apparently he is Harbor Master." Commander Reyes stepped forward, unable to contain her professional horror any longer. "Not apparently, Lieutenant. Fact, this is Captain Walter Hoffman, retired, but that is merely his peacetime rank." She swept her arm toward Walter. "This man, Lieutenant, has a career record that every single officer in this Navy studies. He enlisted in 1956. He served 3 tours in Vietnam as a forward observer and naval air tactical controller. He transitioned to the officer track in 1968. He specialized in critical, non-standard logistics and combat readiness in the Pacific Fleet throughout the 70s and 80s. Miller was shaking his head, trying to rationalize. "But the apron, the food service." "He's volunteering, you idiot," Reyes snapped, losing all formality. "He volunteers his time on different vessels every year because, as he puts it, the chow line is where you learn the truth about a Navy ship's morale. He requested no fanfare, no special treatment, just a spatula, and a place to talk to the junior enlisted. The captain took over, his voice a lethal whisper. Walter Hoffman didn't just sail ships, Lieutenant. He saved them. His career reached its zenith during the Cuban Missile Crisis. Not for a battle, but for a piece of planning so brilliant, so impossibly daring, that it became required reading at the Naval War College for half a century. The captain motioned toward Walter's back, toward the worn, muted patch barely visible beneath his apron. That patch, the one you scorned, Lieutenant, the captain continued, is the insignia of Task Force 72.5. In 1962, when the world was balancing on a razor's edge, then Lieutenant Hoffman, using that legendary call sign Harbor Master, successfully navigated a broken-down destroyer and a critical supply freighter through a storm surge that was literally unheard of, while dodging aggressive Soviet shadowing submarines. He performed an improvised deep-water transfer that provided the critical fuel and munitions needed to keep the carrier group on station. He did that with a sextant, half-broken radio equipment, and sheer guts. Reyes added, her voice thick with pride. Do you understand the scope of your failure here? Miller could only stammer. Sir, I didn't know. Ignorance, the captain stated, is only an excuse when you are standing on the sidelines. When you are a commissioned officer, it is a dereliction of duty. You disrespected a legend, you undermined morale, and you revealed an utter lack of the humility and curiosity required to lead men. The captain turned back to Walter Hoffman. Harbor Master, sir, I apologize for the conduct of this junior officer. I can assure you that we will handle this internally with the utmost severity. Walter slowly set down his spatula. He wiped his hands meticulously on a clean towel, his eyes holding Miller's. Don't be too hard on the boy, Captain, Walter said, his voice now gentle. He's sharp, too sharp perhaps for his own good. He just hasn't learned that a Navy man's pride doesn't come from the stripes on his collar. It comes from the work. And the work is always happening, even in the mess hall. He paused, offering Miller a soft but penetrating look. Lieutenant, I made a mistake on your cheese. That happens. But you made a mistake on judgment. And in this Navy, judgment is the difference between a successful mission and a disaster. Never assume that the quiet man in the shadows has nothing to offer. And never ever mistake age for incompetence. Walter reached up to his shoulder and gently touched the crude faded Thunderbird patch. That patch, the Flash Echo revealed, was sewn during a 3-day ordeal in 1962, deep inside a supply bay of a destroyer. The ship's radio was destroyed, the radar useless in the rogue storm. Walter, then a lieutenant, worked the navigation solely by dead reckoning and instinct, shielding a weak kerosene lantern to keep the map dry. The small Thunderbird, his own personal symbol, was stitched on his sleeve as a promise to himself. He would navigate them through the storm, even if the world thought he was dead. The patch became the unofficial insignia of every sailor he brought home on that hellish run. Walter looked back at Miller. Go get your burger, Lieutenant. I fixed the cheese. The institutional follow-through was swift and uncompromising. Lieutenant Miller was immediately transferred off the Kearsarge to shore duty, pending a full review that would certainly impact his career trajectory. He was assigned to mandatory, humiliating retraining that focused not on logistics but on leadership, humility, and the true history of naval service. The entire event, though quickly contained, resonated throughout the ship. The story of Harbor Master became an instant, powerful legend, a mandated lesson in respecting all ranks and appreciating the hidden depth of their civilian support staff. Weeks later, Walter Hoffman was still serving his volunteer time aboard the Kearsarge, cheerfully grilling burgers and chatting with young enlisted sailors. He refused any special treatment, often declining meals in the officers' wardroom to sit instead with the newest recruits in the general seating area. One cold evening, as the ship cut through the choppy waters of the Atlantic, Walter was sitting alone, sipping coffee. The mess hall was mostly empty. Lieutenant Miller, who was due to transfer the following morning, walked slowly into the mess hall. He still wore his uniform, but his posture lacked the crisp arrogance it once held. He carried an empty mug. He walked past Walter, hesitated, and then stopped. Mr. Hoffman, Miller said, his voice barely audible. Walter looked up, his expression neutral. Lieutenant Miller, rough seas tonight. Yes, sir. Listen, I never formally apologized. Miller cleared his throat, his eyes fixed on the floor. What I said that day was unforgivable. I was entitled and blind. I let my ego overshadow everything the Navy taught me about respect. You were right. I failed on judgment. I want you to know, sir, I'll be requesting history courses at my next duty station. Real history, not just the tactical reports. Walter listened patiently. He stood up, picked up his coffee cup, and walked toward the lieutenant. You don't need to apologize to me, son, Walter said gently. You need to apologize to the uniform you wear. It demands vigilance and respect, especially for those who came before you. Now that you know better, you must do better. That is the only apology that counts." He extended his hand. Miller shook it, his grip surprisingly firm, the arrogance replaced by a quiet sincerity. "Good luck, Lieutenant," Walter said. "You still have time to earn your own legend." Miller nodded, stepped away, and slowly left the mess hall, leaving Walter alone in the quiet. Walter returned to his small table, picked up the long metal spatula he kept resting beside his coffee, and smiled faintly. The work was still happening. If the stories of quiet heroes and unexpected valor inspire you, be sure to click the like button and share this story. Subscribe to Veteran Valor for more narratives that prove the greatest legends often wear the most unassuming uniforms.